Gracie Jiu Jitsu rocks. Welcome to the Gracie Jiu Jitsu Rocks podcast, a podcast dedicated to Gracie Jiu Jitsu and all things Gracie, including self-defense, competition, anti-bullying, women's self-defense and empowerment, nutrition, and most especially, the people involved in Gracie Jiu Jitsu. This podcast is for the average Joe. It's for anyone who practices, trains, teaches, or just loves to talk about or hear about Gracie Jiu Jitsu. We'll explore the lives of Gracie Jiu Jitsu practitioners, how they got involved in the art, and what effect it's had on their lives. So buckle up and enjoy the ride. Welcome to episode 169 of the Gracie Jiu Jitsu Rocks podcast. As always, I'm your host, Marty Josie, and thanks for listening. Today my guest will be Brian Glick, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But before we do, I want to share something that Professor John Danaher wrote about Professor Glick. And it's called The Remarkable Story of Brian Glick, and this was a post by John Danaher. I am mostly known through the exploits of my incredible students and their success in MMA and grappling over the years. What is less known is that I have many students who never competed, who are every bit as good as the competitors. A true legend and a hidden gem of the blue basement is the estimable Brian Glick, one of my senior black belts. I am often asked by people, can I get good at jiu-jitsu if I start late? If I'm small and unathletic, if I'm not a competitive or aggressive person, if I have no background in martial arts whatsoever, if I have a family/career, I always smile and say, look at Brian Glick. When Mr. Glick first began jiu-jitsu in the late 90s, classes were very rough, with frequent dojo challenge matches and high injury rates. Most of my students in the afternoon class were an odd assortment of cops, criminals, bouncers, unemployable thugs, fitness professionals, wannabe fighters, and the occasional dominatrix. Brian was so delicate and shy, I actually took him aside on a couple of occasions and gave him a speech that he really wasn't cut out for this kind of activity and he should find another sport. Yet in time, he showed the greatest human attribute of them all, stoic persistence that allows for the incredible forces of adaptation over time to work their magic. Despite all my doubts, he became the small guy that could twist monsters into pretzels. He went through the MMA phase, training with George St. Pierre and Chris Weidman, the squad grappling phase, where he is still a formidable training partner for even the best squad members. He is arguably the single greatest example of the transformative powers of jiu-jitsu training to take anybody from helpless to hardcore. There was scarcely a day in the last 2 decades where I did not see the remarkable fellow exhibit effortless control over monsters twice his size and strength, and then have all of us laughing with his New York Jewish humor. They call it the gentle art, and Mr. Glick was indeed a gentleman and an artist in that domain. He is living proof that you can be too. I love that. Incredible praise for Professor Glick from his longtime instructor and coach, John Danaher. All right. After this interview, please stick around for the Make a Difference, Make an Impact segment. And without further ado, let's talk to Brian. Okay, I'm speaking with world-renowned instructor and teacher, Professor Brian Glick. So welcome to the show, brother.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Big fan of your work and thrilled to have you on. So I do appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. So there's a number of things, Brian, that I want to cover with you, want to ask you about, but I think the best place to start is just let us know where you're from originally and what led you to wanting to study jiu-jitsu.
So I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, which it's actually a pretty cool place to grow up. I like D.C. a lot, and I was there until I moved to New York when I was about 17. So, DC is an interesting place because, first of all, there is a lot of it is a city, and I thought that when I moved from DC to New York, I was going to be prepared for life in a city, but I was totally wrong. But coming to New York was a great thing in a lot of ways. It's a little bit of a crazy place. I'm not sure, if you've been here or spent any time here, but one of the great things about New York is that there are so many people from different places, and it really is a kind of crossroads. Not only that, but there are often opportunities that crop up in New York that don't exist elsewhere. And so in 1999, 2000, I had a friend who came from California to New York to visit, and he couldn't stop. He was a martial arts guy, and he had been doing martial arts for a long time, done a lot of traditional martial arts. He had done karate with a well-known karate instructor in California named Fumio Demura. He had done Thai boxing at a time when, again, kind of like late 90s, people were doing that, but not at the clip they're doing it now. It certainly was not as well known as a practice as it is now. And but he was doing a lot. He was doing a lot of interesting things. But one of the things he was doing Gracie Jiu Jitsu. So again, I was here in New York. He came through and he said, I'm doing this crazy thing. It's called ground fighting. And I said, that's ridiculous because nobody fights on the ground. Everybody knows that fighting happens standing up, and self-defense happens standing up. I mean, I was raised on, I was raised on Steven Seagal and Bruce Lee movies. Yes. I was raised on, like American Ninja, all of these things. Karate Kid, of course. That was like my generation was that. Like we hit the peak of Karate Kid stuff. That came out when I was, I don't know, like 10 or 12 or something like that. So that was my concept around martial arts and self-defense. And so the other thing about living in New York was I was never an athletic person per se. I didn't play sports. I didn't really go to the gym. I wasn't that physically active. It wasn't something that I was really interested in. And, I didn't really play sports in high school. I wasn't out of place playing sports, but I just never did it. It wasn't one of my main interests. And so this guy had said to me, do you want, let me show you something like what I'm talking about, and you'll understand a little bit better. So I don't even remember to this day actually what he showed, but he showed something that was, maybe he showed me a kimura or guillotine or something from the guard, and I was just, I was like very surprised. I couldn't believe it, but I knew that living in New York, and I had felt this already. I'd been here for a couple of years, but self-defense was something that I thought about. I think that people who live in big cities like New York, yes, where there are lots of people, that's a concern. Sure. And for me at the time, that was something I was thinking about. It wasn't a huge deal, but I had a feeling, having been in New York, and again, even though I had this experience of growing up in D.C. where it was a city, coming to New York, you were like, wow, it was culture shock. And even after several years of being here, it still never felt totally comfortable for me. So the idea that there was a self-defense thing that I might be missing that was really at the forefront of what I think piqued my interest about jiu-jitsu at the beginning. So he showed me this stuff, and then he left. He had to go back, but he left me, or maybe he sent me a little later on. He sent me at the time, it was, VHS videos of like the first, and you probably remember this, you've been around a little bit, the first Horion and Hoist instructional, Gracie in action.
Yep.
Yeah, so he had sent me a few of those, and I was like, wow, this is really something I don't know anything about. It's completely foreign, and I started to, say to myself, well, if something did happen, I don't know if I wouldn't know the first thing about what to do. I would never mind getting like beaten up on the street. Like I wouldn't even know which way was up. So he sent me these videos, and he said, there is a Gracie school. Like one of the Gracies has a school in New York. And I went looking for it. At the time, this was pre-internet. This is, again, like maybe like end of 99, beginning of 2000.
Yeah.
And so it was like Yellow Pages stuff. So I went to the Yellow Pages, and I looked up martial arts or jiu-jitsu or Gracie, and I found a phone number. I called the number. Nobody answered. I found an address. I went to the address. No one was there. And I ran into somebody, and they said, oh, that they just moved they have their own school now. They were sharing a space at an old kind of combination martial arts school. A woman named Peggy Chow ran a school not that far from where Renzo's ended up, but there were like, 1 to 2 p.m. was like a ninja class, and 2 to 3 p.m. was like Dim Mak, and then like 7 to 9 was like jujitsu. It was like that kind of thing.
Right.
So I went there. They sent me to this other place, and then I found that other place, and it was above a methadone clinic, and it was in Midtown Manhattan. So I went over there by myself, and I went there during the, like in the middle of the day, because that's when I was free. And I walked in, and some guy was, a kind of hulking, strange looking guy was behind the counter, and I said, I want to do jiu-jitsu. What's the schedule? So he gave me shoved the schedule under my nose, and, it had, the listing of the fees and things like that. And he said, come back on this day, and you can rent a uniform or borrow a uniform. And that was that. And that happened to be, I didn't realize this until later, that was John Danaher.
Nice.
And it turned out that when I came back, he would then, be the person who would teach my classes, and then that was kind of all she wrote. So it was a little bit fortuitous.
Yeah.
I think some of it was kind of being in the right place at the right time.
I'll say.
Yeah, but on top of that, it was a sense of like, New York is a strange place like that, where you don't know what's going to happen, or what, where you're going to end up, or who you're going to run into, or what opportunities are going to, show themselves. And I think, maybe if I had been somewhere else, or I had stayed in DC, I might never have actually had that sort of experience.
Sure.
I might never have found my way into the martial arts.
Well, how cool that, at 17, you make your way to New York, and that had to be an incredible and an exciting time as a young guy like that, a whole different world for you. And then to be able to kind of get your interest piqued, or introduced by someone who came from California and showed you just enough to kind of get you interested. And then you had the VHS tapes and everything. I can totally relate to all that, but what a great time to be there. Like you said, a right place, right time. And then to be able to happen across one of the best places in the world to learn jiu-jitsu, and one of the best people to learn from. That's amazing.
Yeah, the stars really aligned on that. And I think it turned out to be exactly the right thing for me. And some of that, I think, was temperament, and some of it was, a lot of things. I think that there's a way in which jiu-jitsu accessibility has increased over the last, 2 decades.
Oh yeah.
And there is a sense in which I think people like to come, and it should be accessible, I think, for everybody, but it's not for everybody. And I mean that in an inclusive way, but jiu-jitsu is like in the same way that, some things are an acquired taste, and then there are some tastes that are never acquired by certain people. I'm not a hockey fan. For some people, hockey is life-changing. Watching it, participating in it, playing it, being like, hockey is not the thing for me. So I could be involved in hockey, I guess, but it doesn't speak to me. It's not a vehicle that I really, that resonates for me.
Right.
Jiu-jitsu is a thing like that. And I think kind of sometimes you find the things that you are really drawn to, and if it's a fertile field, then the seeds will grow. But if the field is not fertile, the seeds won't grow. And then if there are no seeds, it doesn't matter how fertile the field is. So I think for a lot of us who are involved deeply in jiu-jitsu, the people listening, you, me, there's something about the nature of this practice, and then also something about us and the place that we're at, that allows things to align in a way where it becomes something really meaningful, like something that you want to stick around and stick with and keep doing in spite of the difficulties and challenges that show up.
Yes.
Which are many for most of us.
Yeah, you're right. And along those lines, so you were trained for a while, and then I've got something John wrote about you. It's, I actually took him aside on a couple of occasions and had a conversation that he really wasn't cut out for this kind of activity and he should find another sport. So that was definitely a time when you had to persevere. So talk a little bit about what that was like.
I thought I was doing great, man. I thought like I was there. It was not an environment that was particularly it was a rough and tumble place, Renzo's. And I don't necessarily know that it was any rougher than some of the other places at the time, that were teaching jiu-jitsu, especially, I'm sure Half's place, in California was pretty rough and tumble. And, it was just, you were either a criminal in that environment or you were a cop. It was almost like the lines were that clear. People were, who at the time, and I think this is something important for people to keep in mind when we're looking from the vantage point of the present, jiu-jitsu was a very niche activity. It was not even as niche as it may be now, and as like, for as many people as follow it, it's still like a pretty narrow slice of people's attention in the world that it gets. But it was super niche. And in the same way that I think, something like, skateboarding in the 80s was kind of niche. It was like you only kind of did it if there was something a little bit wrong with you.
Right.
You were a little bit of a weirdo, because if you weren't, then you would have done something else. You might have been boxing, or you were, I don't know, you were doing judo. But to do jiu-jitsu, it was really a kind of a weird thing. So the people that were there were rather unusual, had rather unusual backgrounds and rather unusual occupations. They were people who were already lifetime martial artists, who were transitioning from doing karate or Japanese jiu-jitsu, and they had been drawn to, Brazilian jiu-jitsu because of the UFC and because of Gracie in action and the kind of tidal wave of effectiveness and success that was going on there. Or they were people for whom fighting was part of their job, cops, bouncers, security people, criminals, bullies, like they, it was just this kind of bizarre grouping of people. Right. And it's New York once again. And so there were also some, a couple of people like me, people who were interested in self-defense, who were maybe not falling exactly into one of those other categories. But generally speaking, those sorts of people who were not as maybe naturally, natural fits for that environment, like they tended not to last. And they tended to quit either because they were injured or demoralized or lost heart or realized that it was a place of, it was bedlam. It was a bunch of crazy people. And the likelihood is you were much more likely to get injured than you were to learn something in many ways, And again, that's not 100% true, but it was pretty. If we were playing a probability game,
yes.
That would be how it would lay out.
A lot more hammer and nail stuff going on, right?
Oh yeah. And I think that Mr. Danaher looked around, and I think he saw that, and I think he saw that I was probably not naturally inclined to hang out in that sort of environment. I was stood out, not in a good way. And, but by the same token, I from my perspective, I was like, hey, I should by all rights not be making any progress. And I felt like I was like doing all right, like I was going in there and I was getting smashed, and I was, on the bottom of cross side for the first, 2 years of training and bottom of the mount. But, this is like maybe 6 months in or maybe a year in. And he, as he told it, he came to me and he was like, you seem like a really nice kid, and probably this is not the right thing for you, And again, like I remember, I thought to myself, I thought I was doing okay. But this is this guy knows better than me. And I was like, well, maybe I'm not doing okay. But by the same token, at the same time, I don't know, man, like I wasn't ready to stop. I felt like I was okay being bad at this.
Wow.
And I was okay being bad at it, provided that I felt like I was learning something and getting a little bit better. I didn't have any illusion that I was never going to be, like I never believed that I was going to be, and I had no desire to be at that time, or, and even later on, like a world champion, or like fight in MMA, or any of these things that I think were real core motivators for people at the time.
Right.
There weren't as many. There was ADCC, but it was this very like weird kind of thing that you just like. It was like a performance for the sheiks. It wasn't like an international, high-level international display of skill and kind of proving ground the way that it is now. The UFC was still this weird thing. It hadn't kind of burst out of its old identity yet into this new kind of mega thing. And so as a result of that, I felt like I was, I was okay. And I knew that I was bad. Like I knew that I wasn't doing well by any normal standards. But for me, that wasn't really, I wasn't interested in the normal standards in that way, and so I think I appreciated his concern, but on another level, I think I took it, in the archetypal stories of masters and apprentices, that are kind of embedded in martial arts culture. Yes. And like, there's often this kind of moment where you're turned away, you're told yes. not to do it, or you're kind of you're rejected. And I don't think it was a test. I don't think he was, I don't know for sure.
But
I've
that's
never
how
asked
you
him,
took.
but, well, I was like, I think if I had an awareness of that, it would have been like too much, but it just was how it went. Like I think that ultimately it was a test in a way because it was an easy out. Like if I was looking for an out, like if I was looking for a way not to do it,
Right.
this was the way.
Yes.
And I think in that way, it was a very master and disciple moment because I don't think he wanted me to quit, but I think that he was giving me an option. And it would have been the easiest thing to do was simply to say, you know what, this is what, like,
Yes.
this guy's giving me an out. This is my chance. I could, if I had left, I could have forever said, like, well, I really wanted to continue, but the instructor, he told me that it probably wasn't for me.
Yeah.
And I never, I didn't bite the hook of that.
That's amazing.
That particular thing. And yeah.
Well, what's amazing.
And I'm also, I'm sorry. The only thing I was going to say was I'm also very happy to say that that's really like that moment. And then actually kind of it happened again later on. Like he kind of came back to me again and was like, hey, I still don't think this is for you. Those are really the only times where I've not followed his advice.
Right.
Over the last 20, almost 25 years, I can't really think of many moments where any moments really besides those where he's given me advice that's made me think twice.
Right.
But those were some big ones. And I'm happy that it turns out we were both kind of happy about that.
Great. I love that it turned out so well, and what's so exciting and so remarkable, and I have so much respect for you because you didn't take it as the out and left, and there was something inside you that made you want to stay. And what's so cool is, as later on, he described you as he's arguably the single greatest example of the transformative powers of jiu-jitsu training to take anybody from helpless to hardcore. So what a statement to have said about you from the master. So what a great story that came kind of full circle. You stayed in there and persevered, and then bam, you went to such great heights. It's really cool.
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the people who show up to do jiu-jitsu, even now, but also back then, but more so, I think now, as we were saying, there are more people training and there are more people interested, that a lot of us, regardless of how we look or how much we weigh or how athletic we are, we go through these moments of feeling like helpless, or we feel like we are, whether it's a matter of feeling, insecure or not able or not appropriate to the task. We all have those things, and if you start when you're 45, and you've got to go through the process of really being a white belt and the kind of sometimes, humiliation that entails, or if you've been a practitioner for 20 years and you feel like you should know everything. And in my experience, even people who are really serious competitors and have risen to the highest heights of jiu-jitsu, you're not, you still have these moments. And I think that each of us experiences this kind of challenge in a different way and at a different point. And it's useful, I think, to remember that we have a choice between either throwing in the towel and deciding that, we're not really going to see what's on the other side of this thing, or not worrying that much about how things are supposed to be, or getting too wrapped up in, other people's goals for us, or trying to plan everything out exactly the way that we think it should be, and moving, and having a willingness to, again, to just see how things go. And so if that's, I think that a lot of people can relate to that regardless of where they are in their training.
I agree. I think we all are subject to imposter syndrome, or at least imposter moments, right? From time to time. Sometimes we feel like we're doing great, and other times we're like, am I ever going to get this completely, or I should know more, or whatever it may be. But that's good perspective to keep in mind for sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure that I want to ask you one more thing about Professor Danaher, and after that we will move on. But I'm sure there's a million things that you could say you've learned from your time with him. But if you had to pick one thing that just comes to mind that you learned from him that changed everything for you, either as a practitioner or a teacher, and has really stuck with you, what would that be?
I was a pretty good student when I was in school, but I often think that you're not really taught how to be a student when you're in school. You kind of either are one or you're not one, I think. If you get lucky, you kind of are taught the habits that good students have and the reason for those habits. When you leave school, there's very little in the world, I think, that can, maybe now more than earlier times, but it's hard to find a way, it's hard to find a map for how to be a student of the world. You're to be inquisitive, to be analytical, to be an observer, to not jump to conclusions, to think critically about things, to temper your emotions with rationality. We often don't have guidelines for how to do that, unless you're the sort of person who deliberately seeks them out and you're taking courses, or you're reading books about that topic.
Right.
So there are a million things that I could say, but I would say that having someone who exemplifies really a learning mindset, in the sense that the work is not complete, and being okay with pursuing what we might call mastery, knowing that you'll never learn all of it, and you'll never have it all totally figured out, and that there'll really always be a process of tweaking and improving incrementally. I had that and have that as a model very immediately. And for me, that was a very big part of my relationship with him. I count myself, I know that there are plenty of people out there who are, either because of circumstances or temperament, self-taught. That they're self-taught in jiu-jitsu, or maybe they have some access to training, and because there's so much more online learning now, and BJJ fanatics and all of these things, there are many more opportunities for that. But I count myself very lucky to have had and to be able to have an instructor, like a mentor, who can exemplify and really demonstrate and live those kind of principles and that way of approaching things. Because when you have someone like that around you, and you're around that person and you're interacting with them, and you're learning from, you're not just learning the formal methods of the martial arts. You're not just learning formal methods of jiu-jitsu. There's a lot of formal stuff to be learned, but you're also learning these informal elements, these kind of gray areas in between the technique and, that sort of thing. I think you really need a person to learn that stuff from. And I have been fortunate enough to be around someone who lives that way and has that approach and does it to the utmost degree. And so I've always felt like, because I can be a student for forever, because this is not a one and done thing and you're never going to end up eating the whole pie, you need someone to show you how to do that. And so I think that's one of the most important things that I've been able to learn over the years from it.
Man, that's great. That's huge, because how great it is to have someone to show you those fine intricacies and how to be objective and assess things. And sounds like it really had a major impact on you and shaped how you look at training and developing and everything and seeing the world in many ways.
Yeah. And I would say also, I believe in, I don't believe in this, like necessarily in like a hierarchical student-teacher relationship. But I believe that if you're going to be a student, you need a teacher. And at least in this. Now, I know that there are probably, counterexamples, again, of people who kind of self-generated or taught themselves and stuff. But from my perspective, I know, just the same way that I feel like I knew, in when I first started, like I know that I can learn this stuff, but there are a billion people who are better at this than me, and that's fine. It's not a problem. I think it's not an issue. I just want to make sure that I want to be around the sort of person who can help me to get better at this and to improve and to understand it. And I think if you're in a way, if you want to become a master craftsperson and you want to be able to build, a rocking chair, if you want to build a rocking chair and like really have it be an heirloom craft that's built with care and detail and attention, and it's not coming off an assembly line, and it has meaning. Or if you're forging a sword and you really want to make it the absolute best thing that it can be, and you're going to invest your time and yourself and your vision and your ideas and who you are into that, it helps to be an apprentice to a master craftsperson. And I think in the martial arts, we have, as a student, you have an opportunity to apprentice yourself to a master. And that can be a very transformative and meaningful thing. It takes a lot from the apprentice. It takes something from the master as well, but I think it takes a lot from the apprentice. And I think if you're given that, or if you're afforded that opportunity, it's important not to squander it, not to throw it away. So yeah, I'm a big believer in this like student-teacher relationship and in the master-apprentice relationship. Even though it's not, I think sometimes people hear master-apprentice and it's this like hierarchical kind of like authoritarian thing, and that's a part of it, but that's not all of it. And to me, that's not the core of it.
Right. Totally agree. Let's shift a little bit and take some of those thoughts into training perspective. Really want to hear your thoughts and perspective on training. How do we keep training for consistent progress and growth? How important is training to win or just continual progress? Working on your weaknesses. How often should we train? How you structure your classes, etc. Just tell us a little bit about how that takes place, Brian.
Well, again, everything that I know, I learned, so I'm, when I, as a student, as I was coming up, there was hard training, but the majority of the training that we did was built around skill acquisition. And in order to acquire a skill in anything, in jiu-jitsu or tennis or golf or painting, you have to have a way, first of all, of understanding kind of what it is technically that you're supposed to do. And then there has to also be a way of implementing that such that you have first a sense of conscious control, and then eventually you can develop it into a habit where parts of it, not all of it, but parts of it can become automated. In other words, we can learn something well enough so that it can then, the fundamentals of that can then disappear below the surface of consciousness in order to become a relatively automatic process. And the things that stay above the surface of consciousness are variables and details and finer pieces that need adjustment. As a result of that, most of our training was and is high frequency and low amplitude. Like, it's relatively low intensity.
Okay.
And part of the reason for this is, again, because of the goal. The goal is you're practicing to get better. You're showing up to the classroom in order to improve. And understanding that as a goal, I think, is the first step. If you're showing up to win, you're going to put other things first. And my experience was, the way I was taught was, we're not putting other things first really in the classroom. When you're showing up to train, it's to learn, and it's to iron out some of the wrinkles that are in your technique or your tactics or your execution, your decisions. You're ironing that stuff out. So if you're having to go to war every time you go into a Randori session, the way that you frame out your decisions and the habits that you build are going to be a certain way. And I'm not saying that you can't build good habits in spite of that. I think that for most people, probably, and in the training methodology that we embrace, it's not, it's more geared towards staying out of a place where you are you're spending less time in a panic mode and more time in a learning mode. So I think what's interesting about that is it dovetails very nicely with the goal of long-term training and growth. Yes. And it also dovetails very well with sustainability in training. So yes. If you're training at 25 and you're training in this way, you have a pretty good shot at making it to 55 and still doing jiu-jitsu. If you're training at 25 in a way that is it's hard training all the time, and it's hard on your body, and it's very physical, and it's punishing, and you're getting injured, but you're kind of working through them. And I think the likelihood that you'll have the ability to sustain your training over a longer term, I think that it's less likely. So again, I benefited from my instructors, expertise and understanding of this. So when we would come in, we would train hard, and certainly you're going to have harder days than other days, and some days it's going to be, very intense, and some days, but most days it's not. Most days it's going to be at a steady, even clip where you do have a chance to assess your weaknesses. You do have a chance to understand what needs developing and what needs improvement. And sure, you'll have some things that you're strong at, and you're going to have some things that work great. But once, like I was saying, once certain things get pushed down below the surface of consciousness, or they go into you move them into a category of like extreme competence, where you're able to execute, and you have a set of, you're able to deal with variables and things that show up and all that stuff. Once you have a few things under wraps, then you can start to focus on what's not exactly where you want it to be, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
And my opinion, and again, don't get me wrong, like I haven't trained, I came up the way that I came up. I was taught the way I was taught, and I've had the person teaching me who's been teaching me. So I didn't have exposure to training in other ways. And by the way, I will say this, like Renzo himself, his approach was, I would say, a little more intense. He was obviously a very high-level competitor. He was a high-level, fighter. He was, physically, he was not tall or strong or big, but he was able to like really impose his will, especially no-gi. I mean, I think people forget, Renzo was really an innovator in many, many ways in no-gi. People were no-gi was kind of looked on as this like weird thing that people did. It was like usually either you wore the gi or you were fist fighting. And so, Renzo really, along with a couple of other people of that generation, advanced the idea of no-gi jiu-jitsu as a real practice. But, even Renzo, for as aggressive and physical, he was very technical instructor and practitioner. He had a very keen observational eye and a very analytical, technical way of approaching the problems of jiu-jitsu. So again, I think, but what I was going to say was I didn't come up in an environment where it was like attributes drove progress. I grew up in an environment where it was, a systematic approach and, kind of decision making and technical skills would drive your progress and your evolution. So I don't have I totally have a counterfactual for it, if that makes sense. But I think from what we've seen, if you look around, there's a value to being able to not get injured, to not quit, to gain some skills. And that seems to be, in my view, the thing that allows people to keep training 20, 30, 40, 50 years. The stuff that's going to decline, what's going to decline? The same stuff that declines for everybody if you're doing jiu-jitsu or not. What's going to decline? Your speed, your strength, your flexibility, your stamina. All of the things, to my understanding, that jiu-jitsu was designed to kind of protect against.
Right.
And I think that this is true if you go back and you look at, what even like really earlier generations said, like Hickson would say stuff like this all the time, like your jiu-jitsu should work even if you're like sick. Like if you have the flu, your jiu-jitsu should still work. And for Mr. Danaher, it's like, hey, the guy had a bum knee and a bum hip and, wasn't like the most flexible or any, like your jiu-jitsu should work. Renzo, not the biggest guy on the block. He's 155 pounds, back in the day. Your jiu-jitsu should work. And so I think, and by the way, like tying into what we were talking about earlier, I think that's part of the appeal of jiu-jitsu.
Yes, for sure.
You know, that's one of the things about it. So skill acquisition, you know, high frequency, consistency, not getting injured, those are the things that really contribute to not only short-term growth and, you know, but really long-term results, I think.
You know, I really love hearing that because sustainability is so important to me as kind of an older practitioner. I want to stay on the mats, you know, for the next several years, and can only do that if I'm not getting messed up and injured and that kind of thing. And I think some people would be surprised, though, to hear you speaking of this kind of perspective and methodology, because I think some people think if you're part of a high level group or team, you know, that they compete at a high level, that they've got to be going hard all the time and that kind of thing. But just the opposite, like you said, you don't want to be tore up, and the more you can focus on technical skill, not the attributes, which are gonna wane, but the technical skill and ingraining that into your nervous system where you don't have to think about everything. I think that's just such a sound approach. And the more you try to learn when you're under the fire, you know, with your nervous system going nuts, it's a lot harder to pick up the technical information than if you're more relaxed and cooperative and really just trying to focus on that skill acquisition. So I really love hearing that.
Yeah, and I think that's thanks. You know, I think, you know, one of the ways that we structure, you know, the student life cycle is defense is the beginning. You know, you're understanding defense, you're understanding guard retention, you're understanding and having experience with developing these sorts of basic fundamental, you know, defensive sound, like developing a defensive soundness, so that you have confidence in your ability to stay safe and not get destroyed by somebody. And out of that confidence, and, you know, I'm very happy to be able to, you know, articulate this stuff. You know, Danaher is the engine of all of this stuff, but, you know, this is the approach that I came up with. It's the one that allowed me, I think, like, I credit this approach with any, like, whatever little, you know, measure of success that I've had, like, in this, it's from this approach, it's from him. But, you know, if you look at even, you know, Gordon says the same thing, Gary says the same thing, more recently you'll see, you know, Marigali says the same thing, but it's like there's a sense of confidence that's bred when you are defensively sound and you have a good framework for what to do, because then you're not making decisions from a place of panic or urgency.
Yes.
And when we're having to live in a state of urgency where everything is a crisis, that's very high stress. People can sustain that sort of environment for short periods of time. And so in a tournament setting where the match is 8 minutes or 10 minutes, you know, you want to be able to, you know, sustain, if you need to, like a lot of pressure and attacks, and, you know, you want to be able to sustain that, and it's going to be a fight for it. But
right.
If what we're talking about is someone who is not training for that kind of environment or that sort of condition, and or has the goal of being able to, like you were saying for yourself, train for the next, you know, train till they're 50, train till they're 60, train beyond that. You want to be in a place where you're defensively sound, where you have a sense of guard retention, and you're not having to make every decision based on, you know, are you going to die or get submitted in the next, you know, 20 to 30 seconds?
Right.
Because that's a really hard place to live, and it's a hard place to learn in.
Exactly.
You know, you very quickly, you know, you build a shell. You know, you construct a shell, if that's the thing. And good jiu-jitsu is not like, you know, you're not a turtle. You know, you need to be more more mobile and accessible and available and active than that.
Absolutely right. I got to tell you, this is one of those times when I wish I had a little more of a 2 or 3 hour show, because I could literally talk to you all day. But I have a couple more things with our time. Sure. I don't want to go back to Master Renzo. We didn't really touch that much on when you first met him and how that happened and what was your first impression, and how do you think he's been able to foster so many great instructors and practitioners and competitors under him?
When I first began training, I was working in the evenings, so my days were free. And as a result, I would go to, the times I was available were these daytime classes. And really those classes, which were taught by, some out like just, for me, life-changing instructors, but at the time, they were just the people who were there. I didn't know any better. I didn't have anything to compare it to. So the daytime classes were taught by some of the best students in the nighttime. John Danaher, Sean Williams, Matt Serra, Nick Serra, Ricardo Almeida would sometimes teach, Rodrigo Gracie. So those were the people that I was around, especially for the first, say year of training. And then after that, it was mostly first 6 months to a year. And then after that, I was really just dialed in with Danaher. That was basically it. But so Renzo would teach the classes in the evening. And in many ways, those really were the crown jewel of that academy, the evening classes. And the evening classes were where all the people, the instructors, the people who taught the daytime classes were students in that class. They were training. Plus, all the guests would come through. People who were visiting from Brazil, or people who were visiting internationally, or people who were visiting from other parts of the country. There was also more MMA-based training. This was a time when, it was really like kind of Pride was very big. That was like the major organization. So a lot of people were training for that. And it was a time when, Sakuraba was on at the kind of at the top of the pile, and was challenging all the Gracies. So there was like a lot of energy around that. And those evening classes were where most people were going. I would say 80% of the people that were coming to Renzo's to train were coming in that evening class, and then maybe 20 or even less, maybe 10% were coming during the daytime. So I don't remember. I met Renzo very early on, and I would come when I was able to the evening classes. It was few and far between, but I do remember. I remember pretty early on, I was working, and I had a job that was involved me like kind of doing some moving stuff, but I had gotten like a cut on my hand that was like pretty serious, like needed some stitches. And so it was maybe 3 months, 4 months into the training, like into when I started. And I went, I think I had like an evening off, and I hadn't been able to train for, like maybe a week. And I went in to watch the class, and I just sat on the bench. The class was, full. I just sat on the bench there, just on 30th Street. And I remember, we had already met, but I remember Renzo came up to me when I was on the bench, and he said something like, "Oh, why aren't you on the mat? What's going on?" And I said, I really want to train, but I'm getting these stitches out, like in another day or two, but I had really missed, being here, and I wanted to come and watch. And there was a moment I remember, like he kind of looked at me for like half a second, and he nodded a little bit, and he clapped me on my shoulder, And he said something to the effect of, you know, like, I'm happy you're here. And that was a significant enough moment that I remember it, you know, from all that was all, you know, got to be 20 something years ago. And to me, that's very emblematic of who Renzo is. And has an uncanny ability to make connections with people. And he's incredibly generous. He's incredibly outgoing. And when you're around him, if you've met him or spent any time around him, you really do feel like you're the only person in the world.
Yeah.
And there are some people in the world who are like this, you know. I think that usually they're like, you know, politicians, rock stars, or, you know, like religious leaders.
Right.
But Renzo has this thing. But I think, like, beyond it being just kind of like a kind of a charisma, in that moment, you know, like, I was a white belt, and so I wasn't like anybody special in a way, you know. I was, especially to Renzo, you know, I mean, I was a student, and I think he knew that I was a student there, but he could just have easily, and I think that there are plenty of people who would have just been like, ignored me, you know, ignored a student who was just, you know, there were probably 80 people on the mat. He had a class, it was in the middle of the class, you know, he was running a class, but he took a second to come over and connect with me about this, you know, why I wasn't on the mat.
Nice.
And then when I told him why, he wasn't like, you know, like, oh, you should get on the mat anyway. Or like, you know, like, you know, dumb move getting injured. You're missing a lot. Instead, it was like a moment of acknowledging that, you know, I was there because I wanted to be there. And I really liked jiu-jitsu. You know, I really liked training, and I liked the practice, and I liked it enough that even though I couldn't be on the mat, I was there to watch. And I wanted to kind of stay connected to it. And I think that Renzo is a person who loves jiu-jitsu. And I think that when he teaches, you see it. And when you interact with him, you feel it and you know it. And regardless of whatever else goes on with, like, the people who are our instructors, or whatever else they choose to do in their life, or other, you know, opinions or attitudes they have about other stuff, being able to connect with somebody about something that's meaningful to you and meaningful to them, sometimes that's a rare thing.
Yeah.
You don't, you know, as it is, and I think especially post-pandemic, like, we know that, like, connecting with other people is a big part of it. You know, we derive a lot of meaning from that.
Mm-hmm.
And jiu-jitsu is, and this is for me, like I was saying at the beginning of this, for other people, maybe it's baseball or guitar or, you know, the theater or something else. But when you get linked up with someone who is really fascinated and excited and loves what they do, and it's meaningful for them, and, you know, maybe it was transformational, or maybe it was just like a huge part of something for them, and you link up with that person and you make that connection, that is inspiring, and also it's very motivating, and also it's a very human thing that happens. You know, you're connecting with someone. And for as technical and as systematic and as rational as jiu-jitsu can be, at least, you know, our approach to it, you know, it's like all, you know, systems is really the driver. We learn from people, you know, like we connect with people, and ultimately for jiu-jitsu, you need other people to do it. Kickboxing, boxing, you can get away with being in an empty room with you and a heavy bag. Jiu-jitsu, you can't get away with doing it by yourself. You have to be connected to someone.
Right.
Either, even if that person is, is resisting you a lot. Like, even if that person is like on the surface, your, quote unquote opponent, or, quote unquote, like, you feel like they're your enemy or whatever it is, you still have to connect with that person physically and otherwise. And so Renzo, I think that moment, that little kind of like it was like kind of epigrammatic for me, because I was like, you know what? This guy actually cares as a teacher about me as a student. And the thing that he cares about is this thing that we both are pretty into, like we both kind of love it a lot. And it's moments like that over the years that I think exemplify like who Renzo is as an instructor, who he is as a representative of martial arts and jiu-jitsu, and like why he's created so many, amazing instructors and amazing, like, he's not, for all, whatever else, people may want to say, he's a generator and kind of like an incubator in many ways of a lot of great things having to do with jiu-jitsu. And a lot of that great stuff having to do with jiu-jitsu goes back to some of the core fundamental human needs and human like responsibilities and human like the things that make us ultimately, interested in connecting with people, kind of make us human. So, it turned out, my explanation turned out to be much more grandiose than I had, originally meant for it to be. But, whenever you get me talking about the people who, were really important, for me as a student, and the people to whom I feel like I owe a lot of why I'm here, I tend to, sometimes I go out there, but yeah, so that's my take on Renzo,
No, you said a lot, because what a great story, right? And I love hearing moments like that impact you for the rest of your life. But also what I'm hearing from you throughout this is jiu-jitsu is great in so many ways, but it goes so far beyond the techniques and the mat and that kind of thing. It's all about connection and people and, human to human, and the impact that has on our lives and in so many ways. So that's wonderful. Real quick, I wanted to ask you about, if you had to think about it, what's something about you that people may not readily know or may be surprised to learn about you, Brian?
Like a lot of people, I think that I had plenty of injuries, plenty of bumps and bruises along the way. I think that sometimes when people have been training for a long time and you don't look like you've been through the ringer, and I mean, I don't think I look like I've been through the ringer, but I mean, we all get a little bit older. But I do think that, like, it's sometimes easy to look at someone who's been doing this for a while, or like, sometimes people do this too with like their heroes, like you look at people and you're like, oh, these guys, they made it through pretty tough training rooms or tough experiences, and they seem to be able to do it, kind of walking between the raindrops. I think that that's just not the case, and so I think it's important to keep in mind that, like, for me, but also for a lot of other people who have been in this for a while, like, we've had our share of injuries, and we have nagging injuries. There's stuff that doesn't go away. There have been some moments of maybe not catastrophic career-ending injuries, but like things that have really been major setbacks. And anybody who's made it to black belt in a culture like the one that, I came up through, and, like many other people, you're going to have some pretty serious, issues. You're not going to get to black belt without some kind of serious injury. Mm. Now, if you're lucky, it may not be that serious, but when we think about what the arc of our progress and training and evolution looks like, I think it's important for people to know that, everybody has days where they don't want to come in and train. Everybody has days where they're like, you know what, they have inflection points where, you have a torn meniscus, or your finger got dislocated, or you have pins and needles running down your arm, or you have some other thing, and there's a part of you that goes, maybe this isn't such a good idea, or maybe this is the time to step back. And it's helpful for people, I think, to remember that, again, everybody who does this has had those moments, no matter how they present it, or no matter how you see them, or no matter how you look, social media kind of is constructed. So, my stuff, thankfully, like, I'm very grateful that I didn't have major, like a catastrophic injury that ended my jiu-jitsu career. And a lot of that is not, part of it is luck. Part of it is the training approach that you and I were talking about. Part of it is, just kind of like discretion and discrimination in terms of like choices that, that we're making. And then, not feeling like you need to put everything on the line when it doesn't matter that much. But, people who are, if you're a white belt or you're a blue belt, like, you may get injured. You're going to have some things that, wouldn't be happening to you if you weren't doing jiu-jitsu. And you're always going to have a choice about whether to continue or not. And I think that the thing to think about is, kind of what I'm pointing at is that everybody who has done this and has seen benefit and seen success and seen longevity, however you define success, but like longevity and has been able to kind of do the things that they want to do, they've all had those same moments. And when you keep that in mind, I think you're able to keep a healthy perspective on your own experience. And there is no, there's no charmed life in jiu-jitsu. Just like I'm sure the same thing is true in boxing and kickboxing and all this stuff, Thai boxing. Like, you're going to have some stuff. So I think if you keep that in mind, and if you, when someone's looking at, anybody else, anyone that you like to think of, I think that's an important one to know. And I'm no exception.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because I think I've been guilty of that when I see certain people, or even watching you on video. It's easy to think he moves really well. It looks like he's never had any like major injuries, or, like you can easily get caught up in maybe you haven't struggled that hard, but obviously you have. And certainly not to say you haven't paid your dues, but it just in your movement, it's easy to kind of think that. So thank you for sharing and enlightening that. It's great.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. I think it's important. Yeah.
All right. So how can, tell us a little bit about your instructional that you have that people can get, and other places social media people can find out more about you.
Yeah, sure. So I have a few videos that are available through BJJ Fanatics, and we have a series called Under Pressure, which is it covers a couple of the things that I've learned, from Mr. Danaher over the years that I have been particularly effective as a smaller person, I think they all, that stuff also applies pretty well to people who are a little bit older. And so Under Pressure, there's a series, and then we're working on another series that will be out pretty soon, which is called Simplify the System. And so that will also cover some of the major elements of what we do in a way that hopefully will be helpful for people. And the videos themselves are structured in such a way also where they're designed to be kind of digestible. And sometimes these videos are very long and it can be difficult to work your way through them. So we have these executive summaries and some other kind of study tools that are embedded in the videos for people. So all that stuff is on BJJ Fanatics. And then I'm on Instagram, and my Instagram handle is bzglick. And I have a YouTube channel also with some instructional tips and tools for people. And that is, I think if you search my name under YouTube, you might be able to find it, bzglick also. But so for people who want to know a little bit more about what I do, that stuff is there.
Awesome. Well, my hat's off to you, man. I have so much respect for you and the impact that you've had on the jiu-jitsu community and so many people's lives. So thank you so much for all you do and will continue to do, and for letting us get to know a little bit more about you and your life. So I really appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate it too. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, sir. I hope you have a long, healthy, happy life, my brother.
Thank you. Likewise.
Thank you, Professor. All right. Really enjoyed that conversation with Brian. As I stated during the interview, I could have literally spoken with him all day. Man, what an interesting and deep and insightful person that he is. All right. Have you heard about New Hope Regeneration? New Hope Regeneration is a company that offers regenerative and stem cell therapies. I personally have had this therapy done and can attest to how incredible it is. One of the best things I've ever done for my health and longevity. So if you're not quite the person you were 10 years ago, or if you're suffering from any kind of physical degeneration or breakdown, go ahead and check out newhoperegeneration.com/Marty, and you'll be able to find out more information as well as schedule a free consult about your specific needs and goals. All right, this episode is brought to you by Breathing for BJJ. And Breathing for BJJ is a 31-day online video program that I spent 2 years in developing, and it's designed to transform your jiu-jitsu experience. There's nothing more important than your breathing. It makes a profound difference in your jiu-jitsu experience. Optimizing your breathing takes your jiu-jitsu experience to a whole new level and has a huge impact on your performance. Learning to regulate your breathing can completely transform your jiu-jitsu experience. Being able to slow your breathing down when you need to, create energy when needed, breathe when in uncomfortable positions and situations, and to find the calm within the chaos are skills you need to master to create and achieve the optimal jiu-jitsu experience. This program uses a biomechanical approach to actually target and strengthen your specific breathing muscles, creating efficiency and effectiveness in your functional capacity to breathe. It's time to make breathing the foundation of your BJJ. And you can find out more at www.breathingforbjj.com. Next up is the Make a Difference, Make an Impact segment.
One of the most impactful things that's ever been said to me came from one of my old teammates, rowing team in college. He's graduating, sent this letter, kind of reflecting back on his collegiate experience and what he'd learned. And one of the things he said was that in life, no one will ever care about your desire to succeed. No one cares about how much time and work you put into becoming great. It's all irrelevant. At the end of the day, what people see is a winner or a loser, right? I mean, you either won or you simply did not. And everything leading up to that, the heart, the work ethic, the dedication, it all remains solely with you. It's a byproduct of the contract that you signed with yourself. To go through hell, to fight in the trenches, even when you're seeing no immediate validation. Which will happen, right? If success came with the snap of a finger, everyone would be running 4-minute miles and driving Ferraris. But that's not the way the world works. But when you make the decision to be different, to give up temporary comfort for something greater, you've committed to the ride of your life. And when the time comes and you cross the finish line first, or you realize success in whatever capacity, you can smile at the world as they look at you like some miracle, completely oblivious to the price that you paid for this. But you know, and there's no greater gratification than that. It's been said that it takes 10,000 hours to perfect your craft. 10,000 hours of walking away from immediate satisfaction to enter this sentence of solitude and dedication. It's where you weed out mediocrity. It's where you carve out your place in history. And if you're waiting for someone to come along and just make that happen for you, it'll be a long wait, my friend. Because it's your flame, and if you don't keep it lit, it will die. And a flame can be a fragile thing. Weakness, doubt, uncertainty, failures, they all want to put it out. And if you're not bigger than your body, they will. Trust me, you'll fail. Time and time again. It may not be until your 100th attempt that you even begin to see success. But if you don't have the foresight and that persistence to see past the bumps in the road, you will never know. That relentlessness, it's how you separate yourself from the people that feel sorry for themselves and watch the world from their bedroom windows. But that's not what you signed up for. Nothing good falls into your hands. It's why every day is so important. Think of every hour as a piece of paper, right? By itself, very little weight, very little significance. But committing to the grind every day causes each piece to stack up. And before you know it, you've transformed yourself and your ability. And that's what people don't see, that stack being built piece by piece. What they see is the finish line as it's crossed one by one. They see 30 seconds. They didn't see 10,000 hours. But you did. It's why you hold your head high. It's why you can smile to yourself when people talk about you, quote unquote, being born with talent. It's why you're looking at them from the podium.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the show. As always, I thank you for listening. Hope you're enjoying the show. Please like and follow us on social media and help us spread the word by reposting our posts and telling others about the show. You can leave comments on the website at www.graciejujitsurocks.com. You can also go to iTunes and leave comments as well as rate the show, and we would appreciate a 5-star rating, which helps us with our standing in iTunes. You can also leave comments on our YouTube channel. If you have suggestions for the show, please don't hesitate to give those. We always like feedback and suggestions. Okay, that's going to do it. So until next time, this is Marty Josie, and I'll see you on the mat.